at the Kitchen Studios. This is the Pencil Pushers Podcast.
Welcome, folks. You are listening to the Pencil Pushers Podcast, and I'm your humble host, Mike Rosado. Today, we share my talk with the legendary animator John Pomeroy, somebody who, in my opinion, is one of the most important figures in the field for the past 50 years. Listen in as we twist and twirl through his storied career, working under the tutelage of the 9 old men at Disney, teaming up with Bluth and Gary Goldman to create their own animation studio, creating classics like The Secret of Nimh, American Tail, and Land Before Time. Before coming back to Disney as lead animator for Pocohontas, Atlantis, Fantasia 2000, and more. We also chat about burnout, how to have a successful work-life balance, and what he's doing next with his new online animation school, Pomeroy Art Academy. This one is a real banger as our convo starts right out of the gates on how he, Don, and Gary took a massive gamble and helped the world fall in love with animation again. And so, without further ado, I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy our talk with John.
The pendulum kind of swings like in 10 or 12 year intervals. I mean, from the moment we left Disney with Bluth in 79, swing it over to 89 is when their renaissance kicked into high gear. They had already produced a Roger Rabbit, Oliver and Company, and they were well on their way with Little Mermaid. So every time they got up to bat, they were hitting a home run, and they were enjoying an amazing renaissance. But it was due to an irritation of having competition outside their walls.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's interesting how, what do they say? Iron sharpens iron. And in some ways, I feel that with you guys, what you and Don Bluth and Gary Goldman did is nothing short of almost being the ignition that got things going again for Disney. I think you guys almost did that single-handedly. I mean, clearly they had the talent pool there, right? That was just waiting to have the right kind of storytelling that where they could utilize their talents in the right way. But that's actually a great way to almost open up this conversation. And by the way, guys, on the podcast here, us listeners, we're talking to John Pomeroy, one of the most important animators, I would say, of the past 50 years. And I don't say that just because John is with me, but that's the genuine truth of the matter. Whether he believes it or not, I actually do believe that's the case. And we'll walk through, hopefully, a little bit of why that's the case. First reason is because you guys did something gigantic by almost doing what Bill Gates and Steve Jobs did in some ways by working out of your garage and having a dream to do something a little bit better than what was before. And what people didn't really see could even happen. I mean, in a lot of ways, you were visionary, but it was also predicated by what you had seen and were inspired by yourself, by what people like Walt Disney had done in the 40s and 50s.
I always, Mike, I kind of look back on that, and it's like I started out with Stars in My Eyes in 73, and fast forward maybe 4 or 5 years later, and I'm realizing that we're bumping our creative heads against the ceiling that really is pretty rigid, and they're fixed in what they want to do. They were in a creative rut. And it's like from that point on, Don and myself and Gary, we became like Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, and Ben Franklin all at once. We were kind of overtaken by a need to want to revolt and start, something afresh, because we knew it wasn't going to be happening there. And we were really worried about the demise of the medium as a whole, because there was no competition. You had a Hanna-Barbera out there doing TV fare. They came out with their one film, Charlotte's Web, was okay. It did decent business, but there was nobody doing great things anymore. I mean, Walt had passed away 6 years prior, and it had lost its vision. Like I was saying, how the pendulum swings in 10-year intervals. We committed the same crimes that we were accusing Walt Disney Studios of. Story stagnation.
Right.
And, we left there, and 10 years after we founded our own company in 79, Don Bluth Productions, 10 years after that, we find ourselves committing the same mistakes.
Yeah.
In order for a creator to be, you always have to kind of almost reinvent yourself always, on an hourly basis.
Mm-hmm.
To refresh yourself constantly, to be involved and connected currently with the world around you. Otherwise, it's so easy to kind of fall into the rut.
Right.
Back in 73, doing that, it's like, I think when we left, I don't think anything would have changed my personal heart, because I had put on this mantle of, we have got to change, and it's like, being a kind of a Samuel Adams for the animation industry. If they would have offered us the sun, the moon, the stars, statehood, ship, parliament, everything would have been given to us, I don't think it would have done any good, because it's almost like you get ordained to do a particular task, which is to step outside the creative box, the safety of the Disney studios, and sail out into the open waters in your own little dinghy. And so it was a balancing act of being terrified and filled with fear, and robust with a creative spirit, and just, wanting to rediscover what we can do out there.
I mean, obviously, I've read multiple stories. Just FYI, I've been following your career since I was 13 years old, so I know a little bit about some of the tensions that were going on between the executives at Disney at the time. I think Ron Miller, there were probably some issues going on there, and some competition that was brewing with, whether or not Don Bluth was being seen as the leader of the studio now. And some people didn't like that. And what was the temperature from your perspective with your fellow animators? Because you were, you were a young guy at this point. So all of the young crew at that point was either probably one way or another, no?
Yeah, it was the retiree community and the frat house.
Right.
I mean, all of these men and women who were coming in fresh out of college, who wanted to contribute and wanted to grow and to jump on the bandwagon. Things kind of fractured a little bit in 78 or 79, because there were a lot of young animators that just came on the scene that were very sympathetic to the old veterans who were still there. I had already gone through that period myself, where I loved the 9 old men. My mentors were Eric Larson, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnston, Wooly Riderman. All these guys were fabulous. And to be able to have amazing access to them was a miracle. But after, 2 years after that, kind of that honeymoon, and we're working and trying to get the creative spirit, at the same trying to be innovative, that's when we start bumping our head against the creative ceiling there. Now, Ron Miller did the best he could, and I was a harsh critic of him when we left. But life's meat grinder, and trying to be a producer and run and survive and try to survive with your own company teaches you lessons of humility and reality. And at a point, I understood where he was coming from. I had trained people myself as a studio head, only to see them leave and go to other studios. Made me bitter, but gave me understanding. So at Walt's 100th birthday, this was 2001, my wife and I were invited to celebrate Walt's birthday at the Samuel Goldman Theater. And I saw Ron Miller, went up to him, shook his hand. He remembered me. We hugged. I apologized. And I just wanted to know that I had understanding, and I can understand how he felt. And I hope that we can reconnect, and I can, help the studio continue its visionary process, because I had left Bluth at that time and gone back to Disney Studios, and I was working on Pocohontas, on Atlantis, The Lost Empire, Fantasia 2000.
Yep.
But gotten some beatings and understanding in the process of trying to run our own company. So I understand what he went through. He was very bitter, very angry, particularly at Don, because he made efforts to groom Don and give him free rein to grow him into the leader that he was hoping and expecting Don would turn out to be. Eventually, Wooly Riderman would have turned over the reins of running the studio to Don. That would have happened.
How did the rest of the 9 old men, the ones that were still remaining, how did they feel about you guys leaving?
It was mixed. I think Frank and Ollie were both kind of bitter and angry at us, because it wasn't that they just passed on knowledge. They were our friends.
Yeah.
I got to work with Ollie for 2.5 years, working on the character Penny on Rescuers. We got very close, and same with Frank. And so there was some hard feelings, I think, there, and understandably, I would have felt the same way.
Sure.
But it's funny. We were at a event in, I think it was 1982, where Ken Anderson and Wooly Reiterman were there. And they came over and they gave us the biggest hugs and were cheering us on. Thank you guys for doing this. This was the right move.
Wow.
To generate a new spirit in the animation kingdom. It was, they were rallying us on.
That was in 82?
That was in 82, I believe.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
we were at some awards event or something, and they were cheering us on.
How amazing.
So it was mixed reactions on, both sides.
Yeah.
And I mean, Ken Anderson was always very encouraging, whether, we were doing it there at the studio or doing it outside the studio. I believe Ken Anderson was the one who told Don Bluth about this book he came across by Robert C. O'Brien. It was a Newbery Award winner called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nimh.
Mm.
And the studio wasn't doing anything about that. I mean, Ken had come to a group of us when we first started in 73 about this wonderful Paul Gallico short story called The Abandoned. And Ken was just, that was his realm. He loved discovering stories. He loved transforming them and developing them and pitching them to the Disney Corporation, as potential movies. And, but the idea of Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nimh, I think nobody was really saluting that. And he showed that to Don, and it perked a fire, a spark happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that eventually worked as our first feature film when we left Disney Studios.
So there were already, I'm assuming there were already rumblings amongst at least the three core there, and saw The Secret of Nimh as an opportunity now, or what later became The Secret of Nimh. But when you guys finally left, you gathered a couple of the young animators and artists that were out of Disney who joined you. And you got in Don's garage and started to create your first, I guess, sort of test film, which was Banjo the Woodpile Cat.
That had already been in the works for about 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
We started working on Banjo, I think, in 74.
Okay.
And before that, we had worked on a short film called The Piper that wasn't really panning out for us. And Don had this thought about this woodpile cat that he remembers from his childhood in Payson, Utah, that was always out in the woodpile getting into trouble. And he thought, wouldn't it be great to, write a story about that? And so it became the genesis for this little 26-minute featurette. While we were doing that, we were started out as a small crew of about 4 or 5 people, and then we multiplied to 10 and then to, 15. The Disney animation production manager was well aware. Ed Hansen came over one weekend and saw our operation in Don's garage, and he was floored. He was so impressed that he began hiring some of the people we were training.
Mm.
So Sue Croyer, who was Sue Evans back then, Bill Croyer's wife, Croyer Films, they've produced I think Fern Gully. They've done quite a bit of work as a freelance company.
Yeah.
I was training Sue as an in-betweener. She was hired. Sally Voorhees and a few other people were targeted by the Disney recruiting program, and we were welcoming that because this would just support us. We were at that juncture where we still wanted to learn as much as we could about not just the art of animation, but the business of animation. We felt that we weren't being trained. We were trained properly in all aspects of creating the personalities on paper, but not about how to running the business.
Right.
How do you contract the musicians? How do you build the story reels? How do you budget the animation feature film? All these questions we felt, geez, we need answers to. We got to find out how they did animation, special effects, camera moves, multiplane camera, if we ever used all these things that we needed to find out answers to.
Mm.
So working in Don's garage became our way of getting answers to those questions.
Yeah, it's like a lab, essentially.
It pretty much. pretty much a lab, and every weekend would be lab time. I mean, we put our we cashed out our Disney profit sharing. They gave us shares in the company. We cashed those out to buy editorial equipment. Our tax refunds we would use to buy equipment for our studio, a film projector. I remember we bought from that was used at MGM back in 1939. I mean, we had all of these things that we were starting to add to the physical studio so that we can animate, shoot our footage, review it, cut it together, build a story reel, show that, and, began, the process of inking and painting and cleaning up and doing layout and backgrounds and all of that, all of those steps.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of moving parts with an animated feature film. And, whether it's digital or 2D, all the moving parts have to move together cohesively. And the key word seems to always be flow. How well can this flow through?
Right. And Gary was more in tune with that process. Is that right?
Yep. I mean, from the very get-go, we each found our niche that we felt really comfortable with. Gary's wheelhouse was always post-production and the business of taking Don's vision to the finish line. Don would usually get bored halfway through and begin working on another picture, pretty much like Walt. Walt was kind of the same way.
Visionary.
Very eager, energetic in that first burst of creative spirit, and then kind of want to move on to the next thing. And, his wheelhouse would be story, writing, storyboarding, layout, direction, character design. And then he would hand off to me to be, animation supervisor. And animation supervisor is probably that takes the longest stretch of creative juice and to sustain yourself. Fortunately, the way the Lord built me is I love creating personalities on paper, so it never gets boring.
Right. But the interesting thing about your path, though, and one of the reasons why I still underscore the fact that your career path is so unique, and there are not many animators that follow the same path. Now, you became both directing animator, producer, and studio executive.
Yeah.
For people that don't know, a directing animator typically is in charge of one specific key character, and they have a team of animators that work under them. What's so unique about this scenario with The Secret of Nimh in particular is that he was a directing animator for about 4 or 5 of the main characters in the film. Now, how were you able to do that in a way where you were able to still have some sort of life? How the hell did you do that?
I didn't have a life. Just in a sentence. And you know what? With the Great Owl, with Brisby, with Auntie Shrew, with Nicodemus, Jenner, Justin. Oh yeah, all of them. So they all came across my desk. I would do all the first animation to set the movement expression for each character, how they thought, how they moved, how they walked, how they talked. And then the other animators followed me, and then I would supervise all of their work as it came across my desk. Here's my word to those people that are just as eager and energetic as myself. Balance. You must have balance. It's like maybe if you can, it's like the animation Yoda in me is speaking right now to those young animators that want to start their own studio. Balance is a hard thing to get when you're over energized and you're excited because everything else around you is obliterated. And that's part of the process of animation that keeps me excited about it, because once I get into my scene, I'm oblivious to time around me. The danger of that is it can be very destructive and toxic to your relationships. My marriage was destroyed because of Nimh. And it took me, I'm still struggling with that occasionally. We're coming up next week to my 33rd wedding anniversary with my wife, Cammie. We got married in Dublin, Ireland when we were working on All Dogs Go to Heaven. So I speak from experience on this, and I just ask, please get balance in your life, even as you're creating these films, because, life's moments will inform you about story and animation if you keep that pipeline open. You know, the films that really entertain me the most are the relational stories, not the big adventure stories, but the relational stories. You know, how people connect with each other emotionally and spiritually, and that's the timeless ingredient that carries animation onward and upward. You know, you look at the relationship between Snow White and the dwarfs. That's the charm of that movie.
Yeah. That's one thing that Walt Disney would always say, is that it was always focusing on the characters almost as much, if not more, than the story.
Always. And that's why he would trash a movie like Jungle Book halfway through production, say this isn't looking good at all, and the story crew are up in arms saying, yeah, but we're trying to be faithful to Rudyard Kipling. I said, but it's not entertaining. Take that out. Let's put this musical number with Louis Prima and Phil Harris in there, and jazz this thing up and build up these personalities. And it's a tough one to always try to get balance in your life. And so after a while, Mike, wearing the supervising animator's hat, the producer's hat, the executive hat, I burned out big time. So by the time we were doing Rockadoodle, Troll in Central Park, Pebble and the Penguin, I could care less. I was brain dead. And those stories are not the best. And I will point my finger at myself for that. And like I was saying earlier in our talk, the pendulum was swinging every 2 and 10-year intervals, and I was committing the same faux pas and the same mistakes that Disney was committing, that I was accusing them of back in 1979. But, balance and having relationships with your wife, your friends, your children, that is all important. That is the bedrock and magma of what you can say as an artist, as a creator in animation, comic book artist, layout painter, or whatever. That becomes your substance. That's the content.
How do you create balance now, particularly? And my notes are off the chart here at this point, but how do you create balance now, particularly in an area, or rather, let me put it this way: you're working more freelance these days, clearly, yeah. And most people are working from home. I hear most young designers, I'm a graphic designer, illustrator, most creatives are talking about, especially if they're working for an agency or a studio of some sort, burnout always comes somewhat into the conversation. I remember watching I'm not sure if you've ever seen this. It was a behind the scenes documentary on the creation of South Park.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah. You might find it pretty compelling, especially as a ex studio head, where they basically have Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, who are leading this team, working through their deadlines, and they're making changes by the minute, all the way up until the very end. And they show these animators literally sleeping under their beds. Under their desks, because they are constantly just working under the gun.
Yeah.
And what I find a lot of times is people working from home now, they feel that they are working more. And I'm wondering if you see that same sort of thing with your peers now, or with employees that you work with. And how does one find that balance? What do you do at this point?
Well, if I'm working, I've got maybe a team of about 5 guys that work with me, picking up animation. I'll supervise their work. So we've got this little cottage industry going. And relationships always come up in a conversation. If I see someone who is stretching themselves out too thin, I kind of just say, why don't you just go and have a date night, or just be with your kids or whatever. It's like, and I think that becomes the more important ingredient that they need, rather than me getting footage out or me taxing their ability. just trying to mentor and shepherd, them from an eventual train wreck, that can happen. I went through that myself, and I'm still on guard. Every once in a while I will lose a beat. My wife has to take me aside and says, look, you've gotten strange. I mean, it's either your ego or you've gotten too wrapped up with trying to, make money or build your empire, and you forgot about us. So
it's great to have that.
Just a word of warning there. So
yeah, it's great to have that, isn't it? To have somebody there.
And it's biblical. It's biblical. In Genesis, it talks about the Lord saying to Adam, it's not good that you're alone. You need someone as a helper. Here's Eve. You need someone that you can live life with. You can kind of balance you out, and smooth out the rough edges on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
You'll be the breadwinner. You'll be the hunter and gatherer, but you need to be relational too.
Yeah.
And that's so important. It's so important.
So you met Cammie, you said 33 years ago. So we're looking at sometime in the
87.
87.
Yeah.
And at this time, we're looking at, you've cleared Land Before Time. You're probably in production with All Dogs Go to Heaven. I think that one came out in 89. When you finally get to that moment where you needed a change, I think you got a call from Don Hahn, who's a very, very high level executive guy at Disney now.
Well, yeah, but we knew each other when, so it's like there's no pretense there.
Right.
It's like we would have fart jokes that we would, crude humor. He started out in art props when I was a supervising animator, and we would, he would come in my room and we would, just shoot the breeze. And I think on one occasion we left Disney Studios together and went and enjoyed ourselves for a full day at Disneyland Park. Just couldn't get enough of riding the Matterhorn and the flying saucers, Mike.
Yeah, man.
And he's a dear friend, still a dear friend, and he's got a great sense of humor, but I just like being around him because he refreshes me, I refresh him, and he's a good guy to be around. Easygoing. I've worked with him, twice on Fantasia 2000, and most of all on Atlantis, The Lost Empire, which was probably my favorite film to work on.
Yeah. Tell me about that.
Well, as I always say in interviews, it's probably the closest thing to an animated self-portrait.
Mm.
And for 2.5 years working with Gary Trousdale, Kirk Wise, and Don, I mean, it was just, they wanted to get away from doing the animated Broadway musical.
Yeah.
Our cruise shirts read, no songs, but more explosions. And they wanted to do something a little more hard edge. They wanted to do something that had a different character.
Yeah.
That other than what's been seen in the Disney films, in the last 15 years. And they made a valiant try. I mean, and every aspect of that production was, to me, refreshing the art form.
Mm.
They brought in comic artist Mike Mignola to give us a graphic language to talk in, hard edge, angularity. That at first I was resistant, and then slowly I began to embrace it, and I still love it.
Yeah.
It's like the language I'm talking in right now. As I'm doing Looney Tunes, I have to put on my Bob Clampett hat, and everything has a nice roundness to it, a squishiness, the old Shortsy approach to animated graphic language, and I love that too. But the angularity in the design sense that was developed for Atlantis was terrific. I loved it, and then it's like, that was a family atmosphere. We had relationships together. They were very supportive, very encouraging. You liked working with them. Every day I'd come in, that it was just a great atmosphere.
Yeah. Did you feel, did you feel odd or weird coming back to the studio when you did? I mean, did it, after?
No,
okay.
No, because like I told you, I had burnout.
Yeah.
And I think it was a God just wiping the slate clean. I had finally reached enough was enough. And what I did was I decided just to go on a trip with my wife. We went up to Washington and Oregon to visit some friends of mine. And then when I came back, I thought, you know what, I would love. Now, when I started in Disney in 73, I wanted to be a background artist. I love painting. And they convinced me that
You're
would be
beautiful. You're a fantastic painter, by the way. I
thank you.
love
Thank
your
you
work.
so much. I love painting, still love it. And but while I was in the trainee program, they convinced me that I'd be a better background artist if I knew the basics of animation. And one thing led to another. And I saw my first pencil test with Eric Larson in his Moviola room. And I got bit by the bug. This is the godly art of creating something from nothing. A personality is moving, and it's awful, but I am mesmerized at what just happened. And so I threw away the paintbrushes. So 14 years later, what resuscitated my ardor once again was going back to painting. And I took a couple of workshops with one of our art directors, a guy named Sonny Apichapong Yang, who's been an art director at Disney, and he was art director for us on, I think it might have been Pebble and the Penguin, I can't remember. Amazing painter. American Expressionism is kind of his lane that he paints in. One of his students is the actor Gene Hackman, who loves to paint, who's an amazing painter. And so I started going to some of his workshops and just loosening up my approach to painting, because I was a renderer. I was a art center illustration major. So I loved rendering and just minutia and all that. Sonny got me to loosen up, and I really enjoyed it. And so I got back into painting. And I went from portraits to landscapes to still lifes. And then I got really interested in military history. And I started doing these battle scenes. And that process reinvigorated me. I kind of it was just reinvented myself. And so by the time Don Hahn reached out, we had our lunch together. And he was saying, we would love to have you back, John. I was ready to hear that. And I was ready to start brand new and fresh. I didn't have to wear the producer's hat anymore. I can just be a supervising animator for one character. Oh my gosh, what a luxury. And so he set up the meeting with Jeffrey Katzenberg. Jeffrey Katzenberg and I hit it off. He's been great. And he said, so John, you ready to join the A-team? We'd like you to work on Captain John Smith. What do you say? You can work with your old pal, Glenn Keane. Boom, done deal. And Glenn and I worked together for 2.5 years and had a blast.
Yeah. You guys were roomies pretty much, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Room right now. I mean, we were right next to each other, and we could, commiserate and bitch and gripe. And when I think of Glenn, there's a very tender, dear heart connection there, because he, my wife, and another dear animator, Ron Husband, are kind of they are responsible for me doing a total spiritual makeover. They brought me to Christ, and my life as a Christian has been amazing. It's a struggle, but I remember walking into to Glenn's room repeatedly with his Bible in his lap, saying, "Hey, you want to sit here and we can read through Scripture?" I said, No. I got life all figured out. I don't want to be bothered with that. I got show to put on. I got paintings to paint. I got an empire to build. And that's the first kickoff of my lack of balance back then.
Right.
And it's like we were into the thick of working on Pocohontas, and it was wonderful. But to have a person like Lynn alongside me, who was kind of just he's very delicate and very diplomatic. He's not bombastic and not self-righteous. He's just a very gentle person, but softly reminding me that, you ought to search your heart a little bit more, John, because, art is wonderful, but art on its own by itself with nothing else added to it, it leads to an emotional cul-de-sac. And so he gave me a book called the Jesus I Never Knew by a Christian author by the name of Philip Yancey. And I read that one night while we were visiting some friends here in Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay.
And it spoke to me. And I had this cathartic experience where you feel you don't have a chance as a sinner to avoid hell. And all of a sudden you feel this miraculous touch of God that you've been forgiven. And it changes your life. It changes, you become born again, as it's said in scripture. And that connection is what's sacred to me, between me and Glenn.
Yeah, amazing. What a force he is. I've actually interviewed his daughter,
Claire, yes.
Last year, she was a sweetheart. It was just when I was getting the podcast started at its infancy, and she was gracious enough to take me as a guest, which was awesome. Little side note too, as I mentioned, the first film that actually inspired me to get into animate. Now, I never became an animator because 2D crashed right when I was getting out of college, so I went in a different direction. But the first film that inspired me to be an animator was The Secret of Nimh.
Wow.
And shortly afterwards, I started writing to Disney with the hopes of somehow finding an animator that I could talk to and have a pen pal relationship with. The first person that mailed me back was Ron Husband. Yeah. It was awesome. I sent some drawings. He came back and redrew over my drawings with another sheet of paper, animation paper. I was blown away. I mean, he was so